The kitchen of the royal palace buzzed with the controlled chaos of preparation for yet another grand feast, and Alara moved through it like a ghost, her hands working mechanically as she peeled vegetables with practiced efficiency. Steam rose from massive pots, filling the air with the rich aromas of roasting meat and simmering herbs. But she barely noticed any more. After 5 years working in these kitchens, the sensory overload had become background noise, as invisible to her as she was to everyone else. The other Omegas chattered and laughed around her, their voices blending into a constant stream of gossip and complaints. But Alara remained silent as always, her lips pressed together in a line that had become her permanent expression. She had been born without a voice, a cruel twist of fate that marked her as defective in a world where strength and dominance were measured in growls and commands. Her parents had tried everything when she was young, dragging her to healers and shamans across 3 territories, but the answer was always the same. There was nothing physically wrong with her throat or vocal cords, yet no sound would ever emerge from her lips. It was as if her voice had simply never existed, a gift the moon goddess had forgotten to bestow upon her. The head cook, a plump beta woman named Martha, swept past Alara without acknowledgement, barking orders at the other kitchen staff with the authority of someone who had run these operations for decades. Alara had learned long ago not to expect recognition for her work. She completed her tasks efficiently and without complaint, but in a world where verbal communication was everything, her silence rendered her practically non-existent. The other Omegas would sometimes remember to use hand gestures with her, crude approximations of the sign language she had developed on her own, but more often they simply worked around her as if she were a piece of furniture. It should have hurt more than it did, but Alara had built walls around her heart just as impenetrable as the stone walls of the palace itself. If she could not speak, then she would not feel. If she could not be heard, then she would not hope for connection. It was a survival mechanism that had served her well through 23 years of isolation. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Martha suddenly clapped her hands together, the sharp sound cutting through the kitchen noise like a blade. All activity ceased immediately as the Omegas and lower-ranking Betas turned their attention to their supervisor, and even Alara paused in her work, her knife hovering above a half-peeled potato. Martha's expression was grave, her usual stern demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like fear. And Alara felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. Something was different today. Something had changed in the carefully ordered routine that governed their lives. Martha cleared her throat, her eyes scanning the assembled staff with unusual intensity before she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of an announcement that had clearly come from higher authority. The Alpha King himself would be inspecting the palace grounds tonight, in preparation for the blood moon ceremony tomorrow, and every member of the staff was required to line the main corridor as he passed, showing proper respect to their sovereign. There would be no exceptions, Martha emphasized, her gaze lingering on Alara for just a moment longer than necessary, as if questioning whether a mute Omega was capable of showing proper respect without the ability to voice the traditional greeting. Alara felt her heart sink, even as her face remained carefully neutral. She had worked in the royal palace for 5 years and had never once laid eyes on King Cassian. It was not by accident. The Alpha King was a figure of terror in the collective consciousness of the pack, a ruler whose cruelty was legendary and whose temper was said to be as volatile as a summer storm. Stories circulated constantly among the lower ranks. Whispered tales of executions carried out personally by the king, of challengers torn apart in the arena, of Omegas who had displeased him and simply disappeared. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, Alara could not say, but she had no desire to find out. She had built her life on the principle of remaining invisible, of never drawing attention, of existing in the spaces between notice. The thought of standing in a line while those infamous ice-blue eyes swept over her filled her with a dread she could not quite name. But there was no choice in the matter. When the time came, Alara found herself pressed between 2 other kitchen Omegas in the grand corridor, her back straight, and her head bowed in the posture of submission that had been drilled into her since childhood. The corridor was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and marble columns. with torches mounted in golden sconces that cast dancing shadows. Across the polished stone floor, Ilara had cleaned this corridor countless times, always in the dead of night when the nobles were sleeping. But she had never stood in it like this, surrounded by hundreds of pack members all holding their breath in anticipation. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or nervous cough, and Ilara could feel the tension radiating from every body around her. They were all afraid. Every single one of them carried that same undercurrent of fear, the knowledge that they served a king who valued strength above all else and showed mercy to no one. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor like thunder, each measured step resonating with authority and power. Ilara kept her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, watching as polished black boots came into view, moving with the predatory grace of an apex predator who had never known what it meant to be prey. The Alpha King's scent hit her like a physical force, pine and winter frost and something darker, something that spoke of blood and violence barely contained. It was overwhelming, suffocating, and Ilara felt her wolf whimper deep inside her mind, torn between the instinct to submit and the equally strong instinct to run. She had never felt anything like this before, this raw power that seemed to fill the very air around them, and she understood in that moment why everyone feared him. This was not a man. This was a force of nature, barely contained in human form. King Cassian moved slowly down the line, and Ilara could track his progress by the way each pack member seemed to hold their breath as he passed, only releasing it in a quiet exhale of relief once he had moved on. She told herself not to look up, to maintain the proper posture of submission, to be invisible as she had always been. But something drew her gaze upward against her will, some magnetic pull she could not resist. And for one brief, devastating moment, her eyes met his. Ice blue, just as the stories said, but not cold. No, there was fire behind that ice, a rage and pain so profound that it took her breath away. His face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and harsh lines, with a scar running from his left temple down to his jaw that only added to his fearsome appearance. Dark hair fell across his forehead, slightly too long, as if he could not be bothered with the vanity of regular trims. He was beautiful, in the way that a winter storm is beautiful, deadly, and magnificent and utterly untouchable. Their eyes held for perhaps 2 seconds, no more, but in those 2 seconds something shifted in the air between them. Ilara saw his expression flicker, just the barest hint of confusion crossing those severe features, as if he had felt something unexpected. Then his gaze moved on, dismissing her as quickly as he had noticed her, and he continued down the line without breaking stride. Ilara released a breath she had not realized she was holding, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she was certain everyone around her could hear it. She had looked at the Alpha King. She had met his eyes, broken the protocol of submission, and somehow she was still alive. The relief that flooded through her was almost dizzying, but it was accompanied by something else, something she could not quite name, a strange sense of loss, as if something important had just slipped through her fingers before she even knew she was reaching for it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation for the blood moon ceremony. The kitchen staff worked through the night, preparing the ritual feast that would follow the ancient ceremony, and Ilara was grateful for the distraction. She threw herself into the work with more focus than usual, kneading bread dough until her arms ached, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, stirring massive pots of stew until the muscles in her shoulders burned. Anything to avoid thinking about those ice blue eyes and the strange pull she had felt in that brief moment of connection. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly. The Alpha King probably did not even remember her face. She was just another faceless Omega in a palace full of them, remarkable only for her defect, her silence. By tomorrow, the encounter would be forgotten, swept away in the tide of more important matters. The blood moon ceremony was the most sacred ritual in werewolf culture, held only once every 7 years when the moon turned crimson in the sky, and the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. It was a time of great power, when the ancient magic that flowed through their kind was at its peak, when bonds could be strengthened and destinies revealed. Ilara had participated in the ceremony once before, 7 years ago when she was 16, and she remembered very little of it beyond the overwhelming sensation of magic crackling in the air and the haunting songs sung in the old language. She was not looking forward to this one. Large gatherings made her anxious. All those voices raised in unison while she remained silent. All those connections being forged while she stood alone. But attendance was mandatory for all pack members, regardless of rank. And so she would go and she would endure it, as she endured everything else in her life. The ceremony ground was located in a vast clearing at the heart of the pack's territory, ringed by ancient oak trees, whose branches seemed to reach toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Torches burned at intervals around the perimeter, their flames dancing in the cool night breeze. And in the center stood a massive stone altar that predated even the oldest stories. Pack members gathered in concentric circles around the altar, arranged by rank with the Alpha King and his inner circle at the center, the warriors and higher-ranking pack members in the next ring, and the Omegas and lowest ranks in the outer circles. Ilara found herself positioned near the back, squeezed between dozens of other Omegas, all of them dressed in the simple white ceremonial robes that marked them as participants in the ritual. The fabric was rough against her skin, and the night air was cold enough that she could see her breath misting in front of her face. But she barely noticed the discomfort. Her attention was fixed on the center of the gathering, where Alpha King Cassian stood before the altar, like a dark god carved from shadow and starlight. He wore the ceremonial armor of his ancestors, black leather and steel that seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than reflect it, and his head was bare, dark hair stirring slightly in the breeze. The pack's high priestess, an ancient Omega with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through time itself, stood beside him, her hands raised toward the sky as she began the ritual, chanting in the old language. The words were incomprehensible to Ilara, but she felt their power resonating in her bones, felt the magic beginning to gather in the air like static electricity before a lightning strike. Around her, pack members joined in the chanting, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that had been passed down through countless generations. Ilara moved her lips in approximation of the words, though no sound emerged, and hoped that the moon goddess would forgive her silence, as she had apparently forgiven nothing else about her. The moon rose above the tree line, and as it climbed higher in the sky, its color began to shift from silver to copper, to deep crimson. The blood moon, rare and powerful, bathing the ceremony ground in light that seemed to pulse with ancient magic. The high priestess's voice rose to a crescendo, her words echoing across the clearing. And then she called for the ritual of connection, the moment when the Alpha King would walk among his people and allow the moon's magic to strengthen the bonds of the pack. It was a symbolic gesture, Ilara knew, one that reinforced the hierarchical structure that governed their society. The king would touch the higher-ranking members, acknowledging their loyalty and position, and perhaps a few fortunate lower ranks who caught his attention. But he would not reach the outer circles where the Omegas stood. He never had before. Except this time, something was different. King Cassian moved through the inner circles as expected, his hand briefly touching the shoulders of his beta commanders and elite warriors, and each contact caused a visible ripple of energy, the pack bonds glowing briefly in the magical light before fading. But instead of returning to the altar as tradition dictated, he continued walking, moving past the middle circles and approaching the outer rings where the lowest pack members stood. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by the weight of the Alpha King's presence, and Ilara felt a flutter of panic in her chest. This was not how the ceremony went. This was not part of the ritual. What was he doing? If you're enjoying this tale of unexpected connections and hidden powers, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel for more supernatural romance stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more content like this. King Cassian moved through the outer circle with purpose, as if drawn by something only he could perceive, and Ilara watched in growing horror as his path brought him closer and closer to where she stood frozen. She wanted to step back, to melt into the crowd, to become invisible as she had always been. but her body would not obey. She could only stand there, trembling slightly, as the Alpha King stopped directly in front of her, so close that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, could count the individual scars that marked his hands. His scent surrounded her, overwhelming her senses, and her wolf surged forward in her mind with a desperation that shocked her. The High Priestess had fallen silent, the entire pack holding their breath as they watched their king break with tradition in a way that none of them could understand. Cassian raised his hand slowly, and Alara saw something flicker in his ice-blue eyes, some emotion she could not name, confusion perhaps, or frustration, as if he himself did not understand what he was doing or why. His hand hovered in the air between them for a moment that stretched into eternity, and then his palm pressed against her shoulder, skin meeting skin, where the ceremonial robe had slipped slightly to one side. The contact was electric. The world exploded in light and sound and sensation, magic rushing through Alara's body with such force that she gasped, the first sound she had ever made emerging as a sharp intake of breath, and then, impossibly, wonderfully, terrifyingly, she heard a voice. Her voice, not spoken aloud but resonating in her mind with crystal clarity, words, forming with an ease she had never experienced, thoughts becoming language without the barrier of her useless vocal cords. The words tumbled out in a rush, bypassing her conscious control, drawn forth by the magic of the blood moon and the touch of the man before her. "Why are you here? Why can I feel your pain? Why does your sadness wrap around my heart like chains?" The questions flowed directly from her mind into his, carried on the connection that had suddenly snapped into place between them, and she saw his eyes widen in shock, saw the color drain from his face as he stumbled back a step. He had heard her. Somehow, impossibly, the Alpha King had heard the voice she had never been able to speak aloud, heard her thoughts as clearly as if she had shouted them across the ceremony ground. The moment shattered as Cassian jerked his hand away, breaking the contact, and the voice in Alara's mind cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any she had known before. The Alpha King stared at her with an expression of such profound shock that it bordered on horror, his chest rising and falling rapidly as if he had just run for miles. Around them the pack remained frozen, confused by the strange tableau, but not daring to speak or move. The High Priestess watched with ancient eyes that seemed to understand something that everyone else missed, a slight smile playing at the corners of her wrinkled lips. Alara wanted to apologize, to take back the words that had spilled from her mind unbidden, but she could not speak, could not explain, could only stand there with tears streaming down her face as the Alpha King turned and walked away without a word, his shoulders rigid and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The ceremony concluded in a blur of ritual chanting and formal blessings, but Alara heard none of it. She was drowning in the implications of what had just happened, her mind racing through possibilities and explanations that all seemed equally impossible. She had spoken to the Alpha King, not with words, not with the voice that had been denied to her since birth, but with something deeper, something more intimate, a telepathic connection, forged in the moment of contact under the blood moon's crimson light. Such things were the stuff of legends, stories told to pups about the ancient Omegas who had possessed gifts beyond the physical. The oracular Omegas, they were called, females born with the ability to communicate through pure thought, to sense emotions and intentions, to see truths that others could not perceive. But that bloodline had been extinct for centuries, hunted to extinction during the great purges when the Alphas had feared their power. Alara could not possibly be one of them. It was not possible, and yet there was no other explanation for what had occurred. The pack dispersed slowly after the ceremony concluded, returning to their homes and dens in small groups, their voices low and speculative as they discussed the strange break in tradition they had witnessed. Alara remained behind, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the ceremony ground, staring up at the blood moon as it continued its arc across the sky. She felt hollowed out, as if the magic had burned through her and left nothing but ash behind. Her hands were shaking, and she could not seem to make them stop. Everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the world, had just been turned upside down. She was not simply a defective Omega, cursed with silence. She was something else, something more, and that terrified her more than any amount of cruelty from the Alpha King ever could. A rustle of fabric made her look up to find the High Priestess standing before her, seeming to have materialized out of the shadows like a spirit. Up close, the ancient Omega was even more imposing, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, her presence carrying a weight of accumulated wisdom and power. She did not speak immediately, simply studied Alara with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold that penetrating gaze. Finally, the priestess spoke, her voice surprisingly strong for someone who looked ancient enough to have witnessed the founding of their pack. She called Alara Daughter of Silence, Voice of the Soul, and told her that what had awakened tonight was a gift long thought lost to their kind. The old magic recognized her, chose her, and bound her to the one who needed to hear her voice most desperately. The priestess warned that this gift came with great responsibility and greater danger, for there were those who would fear what Alara represented, who would see her as a threat to the established order. Alara wanted to ask questions, to demand explanations, but her voice remained locked away, useless as always, except in that one impossible connection with the Alpha King. The priestess seemed to understand without words being spoken. Her expression, softening slightly as she reached out to touch Alara's cheek, with fingers that felt like dry paper. She told Alara to trust in the moon goddess's plan, to embrace the gift she had been given, and to remember that true strength was not found in dominance, but in the courage to be vulnerable. Then she was gone, melting back into the shadows as mysteriously as she had appeared, leaving Alara alone with her spinning thoughts and the dying light of the blood moon above. Sleep was impossible that night. Alara lay in her small bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment of connection over and over in her mind. She could still feel the echo of it, that brief instant when her thoughts had flowed freely into another's mind, when she had been truly heard for the first time in her life, and what she had sensed in that moment haunted her. The Alpha King's pain was vast, an ocean of grief and rage and loneliness that he kept locked away behind walls of ice and cruelty. She had felt it all in that split second of contact, had understood with sudden clarity that his reputation for brutality was armor, protection against a world that had hurt him so deeply that he could not risk feeling anything at all. It did not excuse his actions, did not make him less dangerous, but it made him human in a way the stories never had. The next morning, Alara was summoned to the throne room. The message came through Martha, delivered with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, and Alara felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. This was it, she thought. The Alpha King had decided she was too dangerous to live, that her strange gift made her a threat that needed to be eliminated. She would be executed quietly, her body disposed of, and no one would question it because she was just a mute Omega, easily replaced and quickly forgotten. She dressed in her simplest clothes, said a silent prayer to the moon goddess, and followed the royal guard who had been sent to escort her, each step feeling like a march to her own execution. The throne room was vast and imposing, all dark stone and iron chandeliers, with banners bearing the pack's sigil hanging from the rafters. At the far end, elevated on a dais, sat the throne itself, carved from a single massive piece of black marble and inlaid with silver and patterns that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. And upon that throne sat King Cassian, looking every bit the terrifying monarch from the stories. He wore black from head to toe, his expression carved from granite, and his ice-blue eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that made her knees weak. The guard who had escorted her withdrew, the heavy doors closing with a boom that echoed through the chamber, and then they were alone, Omega and Alpha, separated by 50 feet of polished stone floor and an unbridgeable gulf of power and status. For a long moment, neither moved. Cassian studied her, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve, his fingers drumming against the arm of his throne in what might have been agitation. Then, without warning, His voice filled her mind, not spoken aloud, but projected directly into her consciousness. With the same clarity her thoughts had reached him. He demanded to know what she was, how she had invaded his mind, what magic she had used to break through his defenses. The mental voice was harsh, accusatory, but beneath it Alara could sense the fear, could feel how deeply her unexpected presence in his thoughts had shaken him. He had not invited this connection, had not wanted it, and he resented her for forcing it upon him. Alara realized with sudden clarity that the connection worked both ways. If he could project his thoughts to her, then perhaps she could respond the same way. She closed her eyes, gathering her courage, and thought the words as clearly as she could, directing them toward the presence she could feel at the edge of her consciousness. She told him she did not know what she was, that she had lived 23 years in silence, that she had no control over what happened during the blood moon ceremony. She admitted her fear, her confusion, her absolute certainty, that she had not chosen this any more than he had. The words flowed more easily this time, finding the pathway that had been opened between them. And when she opened her eyes, she saw that Cassian had gripped the arms of his throne hard enough that his knuckles had turned white. He rose abruptly, descending from the dais with predatory grace, and Alara fought the instinct to step back, to lower her eyes in submission. Something told her that showing fear now would be a mistake, that this man respected strength even if he feared connection. He circled her slowly, like a wolf assessing potential prey, and she could feel his gaze cataloging every detail of her appearance. She knew what he saw, an unremarkable Omega, with brown hair pulled back in a simple braid, gray eyes too large for her, thin face, work-roughened hands, and clothes that had been mended multiple times. Nothing about her screamed power or importance. She was, to all outward appearances, exactly what she had always been told she was. Nobody special, nobody important, nobody worth noticing. But Cassian's mental voice, when it came again, held a note of reluctant fascination. He told her that the High Priestess had confirmed her lineage, that ancient records showed her mother's bloodline traced back to the oracular. Omegas thought extinct. The gift had been dormant for generations, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken it. And apparently, his touch during the blood moon ceremony had been that catalyst. He explained that telepathic bonds between wolves were exceedingly rare, occurring only between true mates, and even then, they were usually limited to emotions and impressions, rather than actual words and thoughts. What existed between them was unprecedented, a connection that could not be broken or ignored, and neither of them had any choice but to deal with it. The revelation hit Alara like a physical blow. Mates, true mates, the bond that every wolf dreamed of finding, the connection that transcended choice and logic, that joined two souls together in a way that death itself could barely sever. She had never expected to find a mate, had resigned herself long ago to a life of solitude, and the cruel irony of the situation was not lost on her. The moon goddess had given her a voice, but only so she could speak to a man who did not want to hear her, who resented her very existence, who looked at her with ice in his eyes and walls around his heart that were thicker than the palace itself. Cassian seemed to sense her despair because his expression softened fractionally, though his mental voice remained firm. He told her that he would not claim her as his mate, that he would not mark her or acknowledge the bond publicly. Too many years had passed since he had allowed himself to feel anything. Too much blood stained his hands. Too many walls had been built around his heart for him to tear them down now. But neither could he kill her or send her away, not when the bond made such separation physically painful for both of them. So they would reach an accommodation. She would remain in the palace, would be given better quarters and lighter duties, and they would learn to manage this connection in a way that allowed them both to maintain their independence. It was a cold, practical solution, devoid of any warmth or hope, and it felt like a death sentence even though it spared her life. What choice did she have? Alara nodded her agreement, and she saw something flicker in Cassian's eyes. Relief or disappointment, she could not tell which. He dismissed her with a curt mental command, turning away before she could attempt to respond, and Alara fled the throne room, with her heart in pieces and tears burning behind her eyes that she refused to let fall. She had been given a voice, only to be told that it did not matter. She had found her mate, only to be rejected before the bond could even truly form. The moon goddess's gift felt more like a curse, a cosmic joke at her expense, and she did not know whether to laugh or scream at the unfairness of it all. The days that followed were strange and disorienting. Alara was moved from the servants' quarters to a small room in the palace's residential wing. Nothing grand, but infinitely better than the cramped space she had shared with 3 other Omegas. Her duties were reassigned to lighter work, organizing the library and maintaining the palace's extensive gardens, tasks that kept her away from the crowded kitchen and the gossip that would inevitably swirl around her sudden change in circumstances. She should have been grateful, and part of her was, but mostly she felt hollow, going through the motions of her new life without any real sense of purpose or direction. The connection with Cassian remained, a constant presence at the back of her mind that she could not ignore no matter how hard she tried. It was not active most of the time, not the flow of words and thoughts that had occurred during their encounters, but rather a sense of his emotional state, a background awareness of his presence that told her when he was angry or tired or in pain. She learned quickly that he felt pain often, phantom aches from old injuries, and a deeper, more persistent ache that seemed to live in his chest like a physical weight. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she did not dare. He had made his position clear. They would coexist but never truly connect, would share space but never intimacy, would be bound by fate but never by choice. But the bond had other ideas. 2 weeks after the blood moon ceremony, Alara woke in the middle of the night to waves of rage and anguish flooding through the connection, emotions so intense that they drove her from her bed, gasping for air. Something was wrong with Cassian, something beyond the usual background pain she had grown accustomed to sensing. Without thinking, driven by an instinct she did not fully understand, she threw on a robe and ran through the dark corridors of the palace, following the pull of the bond like a compass pointing north. It led her to the king's private chambers, guarded by 2 warriors who looked at her with suspicion, but did not stop her when she pushed past them and through the heavy oak doors. She found Cassian on the floor of his bedroom, his back against the wall and his head in his hands, his whole body shaking with the force of emotions he had clearly lost the ability to contain. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned and papers scattered, evidence of a violent outburst that had exhausted itself. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, pure vulnerability flashed across his face before the walls slammed back into place. He snarled at her mentally to leave, to get out, that he did not need her or want her. But his hands were still shaking, and his breath came in ragged gasps that spoke of panic rather than anger. Alara ignored his command, crossing the room and sinking to her knees in front of him, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, but not touching, not invading his space more than she already had. She waited, silent and patient, until finally his defenses cracked just slightly, and words began to flow through the bond. Today was the anniversary of her death, he told her. The day 7 years ago, when his promised mate had been murdered by a rival pack during a peace negotiation. Her name had been Lyanna, and she had been everything good and pure in his life, the only person who had ever seen past the brutal exterior he presented to the world. They had been weeks away from completing the mating bond when she died, torn apart by rogues while he was too far away to save her. He had held her broken body and felt something fundamental break inside himself, and from that day forward, he had vowed never to feel that kind of pain again. He made himself into a monster, ruled through fear and violence, because if people were too terrified of him to get close, then no one could ever hurt him that way again. The confession poured out in a torrent, 7 years of suppressed grief and guilt finally finding release. And Alara listened to all of it without judgment or interruption. She understood now why he had rejected their mate bond so absolutely, why her appearance in his life felt like a threat, rather than a gift. He was not capable of going through that kind of loss again, could not survive having his heart ripped out a second time. So he had chosen to simply not have a heart at all, to exist in a state of emotional numbness that protected him from pain, but also from joy, from connection, from everything that made life worth living. It was not her he was rejecting, she realized. It was the possibility of hope itself, the dangerous idea that he might deserve happiness after failing to protect the person he loved most. Ilara reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, giving him every opportunity to pull away. When he did not, she placed her hand over his, her smaller fingers wrapping around his scarred knuckles, and she sent a thought through the bond with all the gentleness she could muster. She told him that she understood grief, that she knew what it was to lose something you never truly had, that silence had taught her lessons about isolation and walls that perhaps he could relate to. She did not ask him to accept the mate bond, did not push for anything beyond this moment of shared vulnerability. She simply offered her presence, her understanding, and the quiet comfort of knowing that he did not have to carry his pain alone anymore. They stayed like that for hours, sitting on the floor of his bedroom as the night slowly gave way to dawn, connected by touch and by the bond that hummed quietly between them. Cassian did not speak again, either aloud or mentally, but gradually his breathing evened out, and the tension drained from his shoulders. When the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, he gently extracted his hand from hers and stood, his walls firmly back in place, his expression once again carved from stone. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had been breached, and they both knew that things could not return to the way they had been before this night. From that point on, their relationship evolved in small, almost imperceptible increments. Cassian began seeking her out, not overtly, but through manufactured encounters in the library where she worked, or in the gardens where she spent her afternoons. He would sit in silence while she tended the roses, ostensibly reviewing documents but actually just existing in her presence, as if the bond eased something in him that he would not acknowledge aloud. Sometimes he would open the mental connection, and they would have brief, stilted conversations about inconsequential things, books she had read or plants she was cultivating, or observations about the pack members who passed through the garden. The conversations never touched on anything deeply personal, never ventured into the territory of feelings or the future, but they were connection nonetheless, tentative bridges being built across the chasm that separated them. Ilara found herself thinking about him constantly, analyzing their interactions, treasuring the moments when his guard dropped enough for her to glimpse the man beneath the monster. She saw intelligence and strategic brilliance in the way he governed, maintaining order through strength, but also through carefully calculated mercy that kept his people loyal out of respect, rather than just fear. She noticed how he remembered names and details about even the lowest-ranking pack members, how he intervened personally when disputes threatened to escalate into violence, how he shouldered every burden and accepted no excuses, including from himself. The cruelty that defined his reputation was real, but it was not the whole story. It was a tool he used deliberately, a mask he wore to maintain control. And beneath it existed a complex man who felt too much and had learned to show too little. She also began to understand the loneliness that ate at him constantly. As king, he existed in a state of perpetual isolation, surrounded by people yet truly known by none. His beta commanders respected him, but feared to offer genuine counsel. The nobles of his court schemed and postured, seeking advantage rather than honest interaction. The lower ranks trembled in his presence, too intimidated to ever see him as anything other than a figure of authority. Only with Ilara, through the bond that stripped away pretense and performance, could he simply exist without the weight of the crown crushing him. She realized that she was offering him something he had not experienced since Lyanna's death, which was simple acceptance, the gift of being seen and not judged, of being known and not rejected. But the situation was not without its dangers. The pack had noticed the Alpha King's unusual attention to an unremarkable Omega, and rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that she had used dark magic to ensnare him, that her silence hid sinister intentions. that she was a threat to the natural order that placed alphas above all others. The nobles in particular viewed her with suspicion and resentment, seeing her inexplicable proximity to the king as a challenge to their own influence and status. Alara felt their hostile gazes following her through the palace corridors, heard the conversations that cut off abruptly when she entered a room, and she understood that she had become a target without ever choosing to be one. The first actual attempt on her life came 3 months after the blood moon ceremony. Alara was working alone in a remote section of the gardens, pruning back overgrown hedges in preparation for winter, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find 3 wolves blocking her path back to the palace, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent, and their lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth. They did not shift to human form, did not speak, simply began to circle her with the coordinated movements of experienced hunters. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what was happening. This was an execution, unofficial and deniable, and her body would be found torn apart by rogues, an unfortunate accident that no one would investigate too closely. Terror flooded through her, and in her panic, she did the only thing she could think of. She screamed through the bond, a wordless cry for help that carried every ounce of her fear and desperation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Cassian's presence exploded in her mind, rage and protective fury so intense that it drove her to her knees, and then she felt him moving, felt him running through the palace with inhuman speed, felt his wolf demanding to be released. The 3 attackers hesitated, clearly sensing something wrong. And in that moment of hesitation, Alara heard the most terrifying sound she had ever experienced. The Alpha King's howl, a sound of pure rage and authority that shook the very air and sent every wolf within hearing distance into instant submission. Cassian burst into the garden in his wolf form, a massive black beast with ice-blue eyes that glowed with otherworldly light, and the attackers barely had time to turn before he was on them. What followed was brutal and swift. The Alpha King fought with a savagery that went beyond mere dominance, his teeth and claws tearing through flesh with practiced efficiency, and within seconds, all 3 wolves lay broken and bleeding on the ground. Then Cassian shifted back to human form, naked and covered in blood, his chest heaving and his eyes wild. With adrenaline and fury, he grabbed the closest attacker by the throat, hauling the injured wolf up so they were eye to eye, and demanded to know who had sent them. The wolf, a beta male that Alara vaguely recognized from the palace guards, choked out a name with his last breath. Lord Aldrich, one of the most powerful nobles in the court, a man who had been vocally opposed to any suggestion that an Omega should have influence over the king. Cassian's expression turned absolutely glacial, and he snapped the beta's neck with a quick twist, letting the body fall to the ground like discarded refuse. Then he turned to Alara, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Fear for her safety, rage at those who would hurt her, and beneath it all, a possessive territoriality that spoke to the mate bond he had tried so hard to deny. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, his hands cupping her face with surprising gentleness, despite the blood that stained them. And his mental voice was rough with emotion as he demanded to know if she was hurt. Alara shook her head, unable to form coherent thoughts, overwhelmed by the violence she had just witnessed and the intensity of emotion pouring through the bond. Cassian pulled her against his chest, heedless of his nudity or the gore that covered him, and held her with a desperation that belied every wall he had ever built. She could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, could sense the way his wolf clawed at, his control demanding to mark her, to claim her, to ensure that no one would ever dare threaten her again. But even now, even in this moment of raw emotion, he held back, wrestling his instincts into submission with iron will. Instead, he simply held her, and she held him back, 2 damaged souls clinging to each other in the aftermath of violence. The confrontation with Lord Aldrich happened that same day. Cassian called an emergency session of the Pax Council, and Alara was required to attend, standing behind the Alpha King's chair while he addressed the assembled nobles and beta commanders. He laid out the evidence of the assassination attempt with cold precision, explaining that Alara had been targeted specifically because of her connection to him, and that such an attack constituted treason of the highest order. Lord Aldrich attempted to deny involvement, to suggest that rogue wolves could not be controlled, and that the Alpha King was overreacting. But Cassian cut through his protests with brutal efficiency. He had already interrogated the surviving attackers, had extracted full confessions, and had traced the silver paid for the hit directly back to Aldrich's personal coffers. The sentence was death, carried out immediately in the council chamber itself, and Alara watched as Cassian personally executed the noble who had tried to have her killed. It should have horrified her, this casual display of lethal authority, but instead she felt a grim satisfaction, a sense that justice had been served, even if the method was harsh. More importantly, she saw the message Cassian was sending to the rest of the pack. Alara was under his protection, and anyone who threatened her would face his wrath regardless of their status or position. It was not a public claiming, not an acknowledgement of the mate bond, but it was a declaration nonetheless. She mattered to him, whether he was willing to admit it or not. The aftermath of the assassination attempt marked a turning point in their relationship. Cassian stopped fighting the bond quite so hard, stopped pretending that Alara was simply an inconvenience he tolerated. He moved her to rooms adjacent to his own chambers, officially designating her as his personal assistant, but fooling no one with the transparent excuse. They spent hours together every day now, sometimes talking through the bond about pack business or philosophical questions, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence while he worked and she read. He began to rely on her insights, asking her opinion on matters of governance, and actually listening to her responses. And she realized that her unique perspective as someone who had lived at the lowest levels of pack society gave her understanding that his beta commanders lacked. She used that influence carefully, but deliberately. Through their private conversations, she began to challenge some of his harsher policies, to point out how fear-based leadership created resentment that would eventually explode into rebellion, to suggest reforms that would address legitimate grievances without undermining his authority. Cassian resisted at first, defensive of the system he had built, but gradually he began to see the truth in her words. The cruelty that had defined his reign was not strength but brittleness, not control but the illusion of it. True power came from having people choose to follow you, from building something worth protecting rather than simply ruling through. Intimidation. The changes started small. Cassian established a formal system for Omegas and lower ranks to bring grievances directly to his attention, bypassing the corrupt nobles who had previously filtered all communication. He reformed the tribute system that had bled the poorest members of the pack dry, redistributing the burden more equitably. He created training programs that allowed wolves of any rank to improve their skills and status, based on merit rather than birth. Each reform was met with resistance from those who benefited from the old system, but Cassian pushed them through with the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to maintain oppression. The difference was that now his strength was being used to lift people up, rather than keep them down, and the pack began to respond with cautious hope, rather than fear. Through it all, the bond between Alara and Cassian continued to deepen. They had still not completed the mating bond physically, had not marked each other as tradition demanded, but the mental and emotional connection they shared was more intimate than any physical act could have been. Alara knew his thoughts before he spoke them, could sense his moods, and respond to his needs without conscious effort. Cassian, in turn, had become attuned to the subtle ways she communicated beyond the mental link, reading her expressions and gestures with the fluency of someone who had made her his life study. They existed in a state of almost but not quite bound, together, yet separated by the final walls that Cassian had not yet found the courage to tear down. 6 months after the Blood Moon ceremony, another crisis forced those walls to crumble. A coalition of neighboring packs, seeing Cassian's reforms as weakness, launched a coordinated attack on the territory's borders. It was the kind of challenge that every Alpha King eventually faced, a test of strength that would either confirm his right to rule or see him overthrown. Cassian mobilized the pack's warriors immediately, preparing to lead them into battle personally as tradition demanded. and Alara felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized what this meant. If Cassian died in battle, the mate bond that had never been completed would kill her as well, dragging her into death in the wake of a connection she had never asked for, but could no longer imagine living without. She confronted him the night before he was set to leave, cornering him in his chambers with a determination that surprised them both. Through the bond, she demanded to know why he was doing this, why he was risking not just his life, but hers as well, when he could send his beta commanders to handle the threat. Cassian's response was weary but firm. He told her that a king who did not fight beside his warriors had no right to ask them to die for him, that leadership required personal sacrifice, that he had always known he would likely die in battle, and had made his peace with that reality long ago. He had lived with death as a constant companion for so long that it no longer frightened him, and perhaps it would even be a relief, an end to the burden of existence that he carried like chains. Alara's response exploded through the bond with a fury she had not known she possessed. She told him that he did not get to make that choice anymore, that the mate bond meant his life was no longer solely his own to throw away. She accused him of cowardice, of using battle as an escape from the terrifying prospect of actually living, of actually feeling, of actually accepting that he deserved happiness despite the tragedies of his past. She threw his own words back at him, reminded him of every lesson he had learned about leadership and responsibility over the past months, and demanded that he explain how abandoning his pack to certain chaos served anyone except his own desire to avoid dealing with his emotions. The argument raged for hours, their mental voices clashing with an intensity that left them both shaking, and for the first time since they had met, Cassian's walls came down completely. He admitted that he was terrified of caring about her, of completing the mate bond, because he could not survive losing another mate. He confessed that every day he spent with her made the walls harder to maintain, made him want things he had sworn never to want again, and that it would be easier to die in battle than to face the vulnerability that love demanded. He told her that she deserved better than a broken king who had done terrible things and carried scars that would never fully heal, that she should be grateful he was keeping distance between them because the alternative would only bring her pain. Alara's response was simple, but devastating. She told him that she did not want easy, did not want safe, did not want the carefully controlled distance he offered. She wanted all of him, scars and darkness and capacity for violence included, because that was what the mate bond meant, accepting someone wholly, rather than just the parts that were convenient or comfortable. She admitted that she loved him, not despite his flaws, but including them, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. And if he went into battle without completing the bond, without giving them even the chance to see what they could build together, then he was not protecting her from pain, but guaranteeing it, ensuring that she would die without ever having truly lived. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable, and Alara watched emotions chase across Cassian's face too quickly to track. Then, without warning, he closed the distance between them and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of 7 years of denial finally breaking. The physical contact ignited the bond in ways their mental connection never had, sending waves of sensation and emotion cascading through both of them. And Alara understood in that moment why Cassian had been so careful to avoid touching her all these months. This was overwhelming, all-consuming, a connection so intense that it felt like drowning and flying simultaneously. She kissed him back with equal desperation, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt his wolf surge forward to meet hers in recognition and acceptance. They completed the mating bond that night in a tangle of desperate touches and whispered mental conversations, marking each other in the ancient way that bound them together irrevocably, the physical. Act was profound but secondary to the emotional significance of Cassian. Finally letting himself feel again, letting himself hope again, letting himself believe that perhaps he could have this without losing it. Alara felt the moment when his last walls crumbled, felt the full force of his love and devotion and absolute terror crash over her through the bond. And she held him through it, her presence steady and unwavering as he fell apart and put himself back together in a new configuration that included her at the center. In the morning, Cassian still left for battle, but he did not go alone. Ilara accompanied him, riding beside him at the head of the warrior column, and her presence there spoke volumes to the pack. She was not just the Alpha King's mate now, but his queen in truth. Her silence no impediment to the authority she carried. The coalition packs, expecting to face the cruel tyrant of reputation, instead encountered a king who fought to protect, rather than dominate, who offered terms of peace before resorting to violence, who demonstrated strength through restraint rather than excess. The battles that followed were swift and decisive, but Cassian's new approach meant that they resulted in alliances rather than just broken enemies, in genuine peace rather than just temporary submission. Throughout the campaign, Ilara discovered that her telepathic gift extended beyond just Cassian. In moments of high emotion or danger, she could sense the thoughts and feelings of wolves around her, could communicate strategy through mental links that made their warriors unnaturally coordinated. The oracular Omega abilities that had been dormant for so long were awakening fully, and she learned to use them not for domination, but for connection, for building the kind of understanding between wolves that made pack bonds genuine rather than forced. She became invaluable to Cassian's efforts, her insights guiding his decisions, her compassion tempering his strategic ruthlessness. They returned home 6 weeks later victorious. But more importantly, they returned changed. Cassian had stepped fully into the role of the king he was meant to be, rather than the monster he had made himself into. And Ilara had found her voice not just through the bond, but through the confidence that came from being valued and heard. Together, they set about transforming the pack in earnest, dismantling the oppressive systems that had made Cassian's cruelty possible and replacing them with structures that elevated all wolves regardless of rank. The nobles who had schemed against Ilara found themselves stripped of unearned power, while Omegas and lower ranks discovered opportunities that had been denied to them for generations. The changes were not universally popular, and there were those who resented the new order, but Cassian and Ilara presented a united front that could not be challenged. The Alpha King who had once ruled through fear, now governed through a combination of strength and compassion that proved far more effective, and his mute Omega Queen who communicated through thoughts rather than words became a symbol of how those who seemed powerless could change the world when given the chance. The pack that had once trembled under tyranny began to thrive under leadership that actually cared about their well-being, and prosperity followed in the wake of justice. 2 years after the blood moon ceremony that had brought them together, Ilara stood in the same clearing where their bond had first formed, but this time she was not hiding in the outer circles. She stood beside Cassian at the center, his hand clasped firmly in hers, as the High Priestess performed the formal coronation that made her queen in title as well as reality. The pack gathered to witness the ceremony howled their approval, a sound that echoed through the forest and spoke of genuine loyalty rather than forced submission. The blood moon rose again above them, crimson and powerful, and through the bond Ilara felt Cassian's profound gratitude and love, emotions he no longer tried to hide or suppress. That night, alone in their chambers, Cassian spoke to her aloud for the first time, his actual voice rough from disuse in private moments when they typically relied on the mental link. He thanked her for not giving up on him, for seeing past the monster to the man beneath, for having the courage to challenge him when he needed it most. He told her that she had given him back his life, had taught him that strength and vulnerability were not opposites, but complements, and that he would spend the rest of his existence trying to be worthy of the gift she had given him. Ilara responded not with mental words, but with a sound, the barest whisper of vocalization that her damaged vocal cords could produce, a soft exhalation that shaped itself into the single word that mattered most, his name, spoken aloud for the first and only time, a gift of her voice given freely, rather than stolen by fate. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you suddenly discovered a telepathic connection with someone? Your engagement helps us create more stories like this one, and we love hearing from you. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Alara bore Cassian 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and each of them inherited aspects of their parents' unique gifts. The eldest daughter had her mother's telepathic abilities. The youngest possessed her father's raw alpha strength tempered by compassion, and their son seemed to bridge both worlds, able to communicate mentally with multiple wolves simultaneously, while commanding respect through natural authority rather than fear. They grew up in a pack transformed, where rank was respected, but not worshipped, where strength was admired, but not the only measure of worth, where even those born silent or different were valued for their unique contributions. Cassian never fully lost the capacity for ruthlessness that had defined his earlier reign, but he wielded it now as a scalpel rather than a bludgeon, using force only when necessary and always in service of protection rather than domination. He became known throughout the werewolf world as a king who had evolved, who had proven that even the cruelest leader could change given the right motivation and the courage to accept love. His story became legend, whispered in packs far and wide, a reminder that redemption was possible for even the most broken among them. Alara's own legend grew in parallel. The Silent Queen, they called her, the Omega who had spoken louder than any voice through the power of her thoughts and the strength of her soul. She became an advocate for those who existed at the margins of pack society, using her position and her unique abilities to ensure that every wolf had access to justice regardless of their rank or status. She established schools that taught all wolves to read and write, created councils where Omegas had equal voice with Alphas, and personally mentored young wolves who possessed unusual gifts or abilities, helping them understand that difference was not defect, but potential waiting to be realized. On quiet nights, when the palace was still and their children were sleeping, Cassian and Alara would retreat to the gardens where he had once sat in, silence while she worked. They would communicate through the bond that had never weakened, sharing thoughts and memories and dreams for the future, and Cassian would marvel at how close he had come to throwing away the greatest gift he had ever been given. He would remember the broken man who had sat on a throne of ice and convinced himself that emptiness was strength. And he would thank the moon goddess for the blood moon ceremony that had shattered his walls and forced him to feel again, even though feeling had terrified him more than any battle ever could. Alara would remind him that love was not about deserving, was not something earned through perfection or achievement, but rather a grace that existed beyond merit or logic. She had loved him when he was cruel, had seen his potential when he saw only his failures, had believed in his capacity for change when he had lost faith in himself, and in return, he had given her a voice that reached beyond words, had valued her when the world dismissed her, had proven through actions rather than promises that she mattered, that she was essential, that she was cherished beyond measure. Together they had built something that neither could have created alone, a partnership that transformed not just themselves but everyone around them, proving that the most powerful force in the world was not dominance or strength, but the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, to love, despite the risk of loss. The Silent Queen and her Alpha King ruled together for many decades, their reign remembered as a golden age when the pack prospered and justice prevailed. When age finally caught up with them, when their fur turned silver and their steps slowed, they faced death without fear because they had lived fully, had loved completely, had left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. And when they passed, it was together, their hands clasped and their minds connected through the bond that not even death could sever, their last thoughts to each other, simple affirmations of gratitude for the life they had shared. The pack mourned their loss, but celebrated their memory, and the story of how a mute Omega and a cruel king had found each other under a blood moon and changed the world became the favorite tale told to pups for centuries after. It was a reminder that fate was not cruel, but purposeful, that the moon goddess knew what she was doing when she bound souls together, and that the greatest transformations often began with the most unlikely connections. Ilara had lived in silence all her life, but the Alpha King had been the first to hear her soul, and in hearing her, he had finally learned to listen to his own.